consider Paul to be my Jerry Maguire speaker. So he's going to show us the money and how it happens. So come on up and tell us how your long and winding road got you to be our Jerry Maguire.
Okay. Nobody in the front row. Oh, there we go. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Paul Fontaine. I'm the Director of Operations for TPT. And I'm going to talk today and try and stay on a theme. I live and breathe operations every day of my life. I've been doing what I'm doing for 25 years. So I live and breathe the plant floor. So I'm going to talk about something called lessons not learned. And it's sort of a play on words, but there's a fundamental theme that you'll see throughout the presentation. That the fundamental issue is that operations matter, and there's a direct correlation to how we execute every day and our profitability. So as we'll move through the slide presentation, I'll try and keep it moving. So if we get to the back end and we have any questions, we can go from there. So lessons not learned. It's all about supplier performance. If we go, next slide. Do I have to do this? So this is a chart that probably everybody in this room has probably seen historically. It's the SAR rate over the last 10 years, maybe a little deeper. But you can see the trough in 08, 09, and literally overnight we saw our build plans and our demand forecast drop 40, 50%. And suppliers and the entire industry had to deal with a dramatic shift in understanding volume and how are we going to deal with it. Part of what I'm going to talk about today is that the lessons we learned going down the volume curve apply as we go up the volume curve, where today we're pressed at 17.5 or almost 18 million SAR unit, and we're challenged with the exact same issues, but it's a paradox. So during this time period, things began to turn around. You know, as we came out of the 08, 09, OEMs adjusted their capacity. Everybody knows what happened in the industry. And the OEMs began to understand the fundamental issue of balancing capacity with actual consumer demand. In the past, the OEMs would continue to produce, put cars on the lot, keep their factories running, and frankly, it devalued the brand. But they realized they had to adjust capacity, and we saw a significant adjustment in the gross capacity in the industry to right size, and with it, there was a commensurate change and huge consolidation in the supply chain. I'm not sure how many folks in this room realize the impact of the 08, 09 downturn on how many people left the industry and the brain drain and the loss of talent that happened as a result of that change. And we're still seeing it today. At the end of the day, as the volume began to come up, I talk about what's called the frog in the pot, and I don't know how many people have heard that story, that sometimes if you put a frog in a pot and you turn the temperature up slowly, the frog will stay there till it dies. Whereas if you drop it in the pot and it's hot, he'll jump out. So I liken what suppliers did and the industry did, that we sat there, we came out of this, we were shell-shocked by the change, and we began to see volume recover, and we got into a real conundrum. We watched ourselves try and save our businesses as they went down, focused on liquidity, cash flow management, cut our inventories, did all the things that we should do every day. Utilize our capital, utilize our labor, but we were under huge pressure to do it this time. Now, as we come out, we have the same challenges, and I call it the supplier capacity conundrum. So, as we come out of the recession and the downturn, the OEMs simultaneously begin to offload content. So the growth of the supplier base, responsibility, complexity, modules, sub-assemblies, all kinds of transition of responsibility and cost from the OEMs down through the supply chain. All part of the strategy of shifting that responsibility, and with that came huge challenges. So we had volume starting to come back up slowly, and if you look at the SAR curve, year over year it grew to where we are today. But at the same time, launches accelerated. I don't know how many people have looked at the pace and the cadence of launches, but the launch pace it's literally tripled in terms of the number of new products we have to deal with and the speed at which an OEM now launches. When I started my career a long time ago, I remember launching at GM Oshawa and it was aluminum Monte Carlo in 1992, and we launched over a 3-month period, all white, low trim, and up we came, and it basically took us 3.5 months to go from 0 to our full line rate. Today, OEMs launch with loss of authorization of maybe 15 to 30 days. They do not let their plants sit idle. Most plants now have concurrent or simultaneous launches, and all of those changes in both complexity, the cadence of launches, and the amount of responsibility that suppliers had drove huge challenges. So what you see here is as the OEMs transferred responsibility, they all began to spend a lot of money understanding supply chain performance. And if you go back to my first slide, I talked about, this is about supplier performance. In the old days, a supplier just had to give me a good part. Just get it to my plant and make sure it's good quality. Today, that's completely changed. So they began implementing things like financial metrics tracking. We now have to submit our financials to a third party. They're looking at the health of the business. The problem is financial metrics are lagging indicators. And very often, if it's a privately held firm, the level of transparency doesn't exist. So the OEMs today all struggle with, how do I have better visibility to my supplier's performance? And not just, did the parts show up and were they quality? It's, are they healthy? How are they running? You know, things that they can't see. And it's my belief that the operational metrics that they don't get to see or that they're learning to and understanding are the key. And if you look at that simple little chart, it's what we call speed to detection. The longer the delay between understanding you have a problem and when you expose it, the greater the cost. So everything we do and everything as an organization we try and do is drive the speed to detection back as far back in the process as we can so that we expose that risk, mitigate it, manage it, and minimize the impact on the business. So the difference in what I talk about supplier performance, 20 years ago, make me a good part, get it to my plant. Today, make me a good part, get it there on time. I want you to provide me with embedded quality data. I want to deliver JIT. I want you to sequence to my broadcast. And oh, by the way, you got to hit your cost targets. And I need you to help me manage a significant portion of my new product development process. So suppliers are now responsible for a significant amount of complexity management, cost management that really was not there before. All of those things provided huge challenges, and many suppliers were successful at doing that, and the strong survived and grew, but others are still working out the kinks and trying to figure that out. Consolidation of the supply base reduced gross capacity, and this is where we start to get into the conundrum I talk about. So as the volume went up, we had consolidation in the supply chain, capacity and utilization started to go up. So our plants, part of the reason that the supply base suffered in 2008, 2009 is when the volume dropped, we underabsorbed our fixed capital. We didn't have enough volume to pay the bills. We had these beautiful homes with lots of equipment and no volume. And if you don't make a part, you don't generate a contribution to fixed burden, you don't pay the labor bill, you don't pay the heating bill, and that's what killed us. And it hurt a lot of companies. Part of the problem was money was cheap, it was easier to capitalize than optimize. So I'll throw another press at it, I'll throw another plant. Why don't we focus on improving the core operation and squeezing our assets and driving other core metrics? So at the end of the day, as the volume went up, in theory, the industry had less capacity. We should see higher levels of utilization, which we do, which in theory then says we're overabsorbing, in some cases, our costs, and we should be making more money. As the SAR continues to grow, what's interesting is we're not at the historical highs of 16, 17. We're still ramping up. Suppliers begin to experience capacity constraints. And the question is why? Why were we able to build at 17, 18 million, and now we can't? And I talked about it a little earlier. Part of the problem was the mix changed, the level of complexity changed, the number of variants that we had to produce changed. So we weren't making 500,000 of part A, we were making 500,000 of part A, B, C, D, E, and we still had to do that in the same environment. So all of these things contributed to huge challenges for the supply base and all the manufacturers to deal with acceleration, complexity, and do it effectively. The key question, as I said earlier, is why, when things should be getting much better, are suppliers struggling? And they're not all struggling, but I can tell you I spend every day of my life in plants that I walk into that don't know how they're performing to their own internal cost structure. So the lessons not learned is, in my opinion, and this is all my opinion, that easy, cheap capital in the early period created a culture where it was easier to solve a problem by throwing more capacity at it than managing my existing capacity. We didn't pay attention, and today, many companies that we help still don't understand fundamental OEE, what's the return on capital employed, what is my first time quality, and all those kinds of basic core measures. And it's sad when I walk into a plant and I ask the fundamental question, how you running today? We're gonna make schedule. And not, well, we're running at X or Y, and really be able to tell me fundamentally how they're doing. The standard response when a plant gets in trouble is to do what? I can't make schedule, OEM's on me, so I'm gonna schedule Saturdays, and I'm gonna work overtime. And then guess what? The volume starts to go up, and now I got more pressure on my system, so what do? I schedule Sundays. So now I'm running my plant 6.5, in some cases 7 days a week to meet volume. How many folks in here experience that their plants are running 6, 7 days a week to support current volume? Lots, right? And you ask yourself, why am I running 6.5 days a week when my installed capacity, right, at the appropriate OEE performance level, meaning my proper uptime, my proper yield rate, my proper cycle time, I should be able to support the volume on 5 days a week. Why can't I? Because I'm not measuring the right stuff. And we've become accustomed to running the business to the schedule, and I made it through the week. I didn't shut them down. I'm good. Instead of, let's fix the core operation, get my utilization rates where they need to be. And what happens is we get into what's called the OEE spiral. When a plant gets in trouble, what happens? I'm working 5 days, then 6, now I'm on 3 shifts, and then guess what starts to happen? Why is my attrition rate and my turnover rate starting to escalate? My absenteeism rate goes up. I can't get my skilled trades to come in every weekend. They get frustrated, and we start to spiral, and my OEE, instead of going up, begins to degrade at a faster rate. We call that the OEE spiral. When companies have not managed the core metrics, have allowed themselves to degrade to a point where they're now caught in this really difficult spiral, and how do I get out of this mess where I'm running 7 days a week, everybody's tired, and I can't even do the things I should be doing. Think about, if you're running 7 days a week, when are you doing your PM? What are you doing anything proactive to run your business? You're just trying to survive. So this OEE spiral is what I think the lesson not learned is all about. We don't today still do a good job measuring core operational performance. And the negative consequences, and the gentleman who introduced me talked about connect the dot to profitability. When you look at your P&L and go, what's that labor variance that I'm driving every month? Well, what do you think that labor variance is? It's all the overtime you're working to make the same number of parts that you should be making in 5 days a week. And oh, by the way, you're running your capital 5 or 6 or 7 days, so you're working more operational hours, spending more on electricity, more on you. All of the cost inputs are now at 140% of your plan, and it's driving huge impact to the P&L. So when we quote a part, we make assumptions about uptime, about cycle time, about labor input. And in the old days, I was taught that there's a budgeted work standard, and then we deal with the current work standard, which is what the variance is. I go to companies today that can't tell me, how are you running to your standard cost? And they look at me like, what are you talking about? Well, what should your cycle time be? How many people should be on this? What's your required to operate? And they struggle and go, I'm just trying to get through the day. And then they wonder why they're not hitting their financial targets. And it is a huge, huge challenge in an environment where the volume keeps coming people who tell me that there is unemployment and labor, issues, I say, go to the plants where I go where they can't find people. They can't get enough people to come in and work. They can't find millwrights and electricians and techs and a controls engineer. If there's any controls engineers in here that aren't working overtime right now, I'd be surprised because they're all pretty busy. Everyone is struggling getting the right people to help them run their operations. So the OEE spiral creates an iceberg, and think about, you got poor OE up here and all of the hidden costs down below that eventually migrate to the P&L. So overall equipment effectiveness, that boring sort of manufacturing term, is all about availability. Is my equipment up at the level I said I would run it at? If I'm scheduled 8 hours a shift, how many hours should that machine be up? What is my cycle time, and am I meeting it? And what is my yield rate? Those three numbers combined convert into what's called the OEE score. And we walk into many plants that tell us they're running at 85, 90% OEE. And I go, okay, then why are you working 7 days a week? And there's something called quick OEE, where you can go in and say, you made 100 parts in the last 8 hours. Your cycle time says you'd make 200. Where are they? You're running at 50% OEE. The problem when you understate what your real OEE is, you don't really accept where you are on capacity, where you are on cost, and frankly, it gets into a problem where you back yourself into a corner where poor OEE performance is driving you to run more hours and you can't escape. So we see plants that think they're running at 85 and they're actually running 40 or 50. So when we do work for an OEM and go into a supplier that can't keep up, the first thing we look at is, what is the installed capacity and what are you actually running at? And it's amazing the gap between what they could run if they could achieve their targets and what they're actually running at. And all of those gaps are variances that hit the P&L. So availability is about managing your capital against your targeted uptime and schedule. Many companies run to a schedule, not to a planned capacity plan. Dynamic capacity is net of OEE loss. So if you should make 200 and you make 100, your OEE is 50, but the real holy grail in the equation is, where am I losing it? Is it uptime? Is it yield loss? Is it cycle time variation? Understanding at the fundamental level, at an operational level, what that is the beginning of understanding how to fix your problem. If you got a yield problem, you got to improve your quality and your capability. Because remember, if you make a bad part and you got to make it over again, it costs you 3x in capacity. You made a bad one, you got to make another one to replace it, and you lose the opportunity to make a third. So yield loss is a significant impact on capacity. And imagine a line where you've got 15 operations in flow and you're losing yield on every operation. So if Op 10 is running at 97% first time capable, and that pattern is being repeated, by the time you get done, your first time capability full stream is in the 50s or 60s. So Op 10 has to run at 160% of its design capacity to make up for the downstream yield loss, because each internal customer is then handing its next customer less and less product. So then everybody looks and says, well, I'm scheduling the plant, but if you don't know your yield loss, full value stream, you may be under scheduling and not understanding what your true throughput number is. So understanding yield and the effective yield on capacity is critical. The next one is cycle time. If you're not meeting cycle time, and for example, you've got a process that should run at 30 seconds, and it runs at 45. How much? You've just lost 50% of your capacity. So we do layered audits on quality. How often do you and your plants do a cycle time verification? To recenter and make sure that you're meeting cycle time per your standard and you're actually doing the things you said you would do. And it's not hard. Empower your supervisors, your team leaders to go out, teach them what to look for, and then tell them how to run their shop. It's like having a car without a speedometer. If you don't know where you're going off the track. So the things we talk about around OEE, whether it be yield loss or cycle time, are not difficult problems to solve. They require high levels of discipline to measure, track, and react in real time. So that's part of the answer. A lack of focus on basic metrics on the shop floor, hour by hour, in my opinion, is one of the fundamental challenges we as leaders need to deal with. So how do you manage a difficult thing like OEE or uptime or availability and cycle time? You manage it in real time. How many quality people are in the room? So when you have a process out of control, what do? You increase the frequency of measure, right? Till you're back and you're stabilized. We all forgot about SPC and statistical process control and process drift. Well, you could have the same way to think about your operational metrics. Create operational SPC for OEE, set your control limits, and treat your operational metrics the same way you would create a tolerance. So we all know these basic principles. It's applying them differently and thinking through how to do that in real time and teach and coach those frontline supervisors to manage their business with data, but in real time, and give them tools that they don't need to be an SBC expert or a math expert. Just teach them process drift and how to recenter. Now you got 25 people working on OEE instead of some engineer and some quality team developing a list and putting it on a PDCA and going, well, we're working on that. And well, it's too late, because you got to manage it in real time. Cycle time compliance, I talked about again. It's another one where if you're going to do a layered audit, find the constraint in your plant that drives your throughput. How many people in this room know their operational bottlenecks and pacemakers? You need to know what drives the throughput in your plant. What is the pacemaker, and what are the key process parameters that drive that pacemaker? And measure it and manage it intently. Because if the pacemaker's not meeting target, nothing else is. And guess what? If the pacemaker, which is your slowest operation, isn't meeting target, everything upstream of that or downstream is being constrained. So you got trapped labor that's basically not doing anything, waiting for the constraint to break. That trapped labor turns into dollars. Quality, again, we talked about not hitting your yield rates and understanding your first-time capability, and not at the end of the line at every process. What is my yield op by op by op? That requires someone to get off their butt, out from behind their tube, and go spend time on the floor. We talk about Gemba, we talk about Gemba walks. Go understand, do a value stream map, and understand yield at a high level of detail. And when you see what you're losing, then map that together, and you'll start to understand where are my capacity going. This is an example of a key. When we look at capacity, and the OEMs do what's called trap lines or process demonstration runs to see whether or not a supplier can make rate. And we'll go in and the supplier will tell me I'm running at 85%. And the chart on the left is a simple little illustration of a supplier that tells you I'm doing great. So the supplier quality engineer, or in Ford Motor Co, that'd be a TSA, I think. Yep. Will say we're good to go. And then they walk out, and then all of a sudden the supplier starts to run real life. They've got complexity. They share that line with somebody else. They didn't see a true changeover. And now you get to see the true OEE, and the illustration on the right is the reality of what that supplier is actually running at. So when you think you're okay, and this applies to a tier 1 that has tier 2s, that you need to understand their capacity, you better understand their OEE performance to make sure that they've got the real capacity, they're using real data, you validate it, and you don't put yourself into harm's way by thinking you have a supplier that's ready to perform, says they can perform. I want to see data. And frankly, a 2-hour, run at rate isn't enough. It is not enough. And I've had many, many discussions, and I know I have senior OEM people in the room. Those SQEs don't have the subject matter expertise. They don't have the time to really understand that supplier's dynamic capacity. Because if they tell you they're running at 85 and 3 other lines in the plant are running at 50, I don't know what they're going to do different. But it's kind of hard to say, well, you're going to all of a sudden make a mean shift improvement, a 35% improvement in OEE, just because we're launching. But they want to get you out of the plant and get on with life. But that's an important lesson learned. So when you're not hitting your OEE, you're driving up all kinds of negative consequences. Tons of increased operational hours, increased labor costs, and the other one I think that everyone is starting to feel, you're stressing the heck out of your indirect, right? You can 3-crew, you can work on, alternating shifts, but those maintenance techs, you can't find them and staff 7 days a week. So what you'll see is your mean time to repair metrics decay, and you start to suffer in terms of your ability to react, to do maintenance, and bring your systems back online. Because no one can be effective working 7/12s. So every variance, almost every variance on the P&L, in my opinion, can be linked to an OEE metric. Everyone. So think about your material variances and how many of those are tied to poor scrap reporting and not understanding where's it all going, right? We'll find it in the ending inventory. So when I go to a plant, one of the first questions I ask is, how's your inventory accuracy? What's your book to physical like? And if they don't know, you just drive that back and say, you don't really understand where you're losing material in your system. And that's a key indicator of risk. So every variance on the P&L can eventually be linked to an OEE metric. So what happens is you get into the OEE spiral I talked about, and here's a great example of a plant that has now hit the wall. They're running 7 days a week, they can't get better, and there ain't no 8th day. So what do? This is when airplanes and logistics companies make a lot of money. When all you start to do now is produce to keep up, you fly, you expedite, and you hope to God that you get a breather till the next holiday when you can recover and rebuffer. And I see that in a lot of places I go. They just hope, what's the next window? But there are things that can be done. When you have a supplier that's in trouble, and whether you're an OEM or a tier 1, one of the first things you can do to help them is reduce complexity. Help them offload, reduce complexity, because when you reduce complexity, you reduce the number of changeovers, you drive up their batch size, and so there's part of the conundrum. We all want to be one-piece flow, we all want to produce in a small lot, but when you get into an OEE spiral, one of the ways out is to do the inverse. Get your batch size up, reduce complexity, recover, buy some time, and then reintroduce complexity back into the system. So that's an example of you've hit the wall. There's nowhere to go, you're red across the board, and you've run out of time. So the lessons not learned is all about linking the operational metrics to the financial performance. Again, we talked about it, cheap capital, the availability of just adding a piece of equipment. You should not add a piece of equipment until you're at your targeted level, because what you're going to do is you're going to mask the problem. No different than in the old days, we would add inventory to mask risk. Today we add capital to mask ROE performance. I'll go put another press in and solve my problem. When the volume drops, you still got to service that debt on that increased capital. And then we're right back into the same boat we were before. So when we talked about what happened in 08, 09 as we went down, managing our capital, managing our inventory, driving down our WIP, it's the same things we should be doing every day. Managing the key inputs in our cost structure and paying attention to them. So one of the challenges is, how do you get real-time OEE data? How many folks in this room have TAC boards or some type of visual management in their plant to track performance? Okay, so you walk out and great, I'm marking down, I should have made 80, I put up 65. Well, I walk through plants and it's red, 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 red. No, what's somebody doing about it? Right? The intensity of the leadership team to go to the floor, to support, to intervene, to help and understand and not blame the operators and the teams is the big challenge. So we lack today the real-time metrics, and what was interesting is when we were out in the breakout area, there are lots of capabilities out there technologically to track OEE in real time, to pull data off your equipment, but you got to understand it before you start thinking technology is going to solve it for you. Because the software is not going to go out there and fix the root issue. It's going to tell you where to go. It's going to tell you where your hotspots are. But at the end of the day, you still got to go solve problems. And you got to improve process capability, repeatability, uptime. You got to improve your maintenance systems. Or you just have a fancy electronic dashboard telling you you're going to hit the ditch. So what are the key enablers for everyone to get better? In my opinion, supplier performance is no longer just about quality. In the past, quality was a differentiator. Now I believe that suppliers that can execute operationally, quality, delivery, cost, new product, sequencing, kitting, that's going to be the difference. There needs to be a massive education process. Many plants that I go into, and I talk to supervisors or even production managers and ask them, what's OEE? They don't know. They really don't understand, and no one's taken the time to sit them down. They think it's too complex. It's not. Just break it down for them. And then again, there's going to be an ongoing need to improve transparency. Suppliers, in my opinion, should not expect an OEM to subsidize poor OEE. We in our business do a lot of work for the OEMs, validating supplier capacity. And when the supplier says, I need another line to meet the rate, and I go, no, they don't. They need to fix their OEE. And the OEM says, I'm not giving you any more money. Why would I subsidize poor OEE? Because all I'm doing is kicking the can down the road that at some point, when the volume drops or there's a change, you're overcapitalized. And I think it's Sergio Marchione talks about that the automotive industry is a poor user of capital. The return on capital employed compared to other industries is terrible on a comparative basis because we don't do a good job squeezing our assets effectively and getting the rate of return that we need to get on them. So again, there's going to be an ongoing need for transparency, and I think that's going to continue to grow. I can see OEMs beginning to do real-time process monitoring of key supplier performance so that they get an early warning system of degradation in OEE performance that they can then extrapolate and say this plant is heading to a point where my buffer's going to drop, I need to intervene. I think we're going to see that, and already directionally that's where they're going. Again, improvements in the way we do supplier readiness and the way you get ready to run as leaders in your plants and in your organizations. You need to find ways to stress your plants early and hard. You got to expose the rock. You got to understand what it's like to run at rate, run at mix, and run at full complexity and at true what the real world's going to be. I think we get through our launch curves and we make it, and then all of a sudden we're real world, and guess what? Now we're into a real difficult situation because if I stop, I'm going to shut the OEM down. So finding ways to stress your organization and get things done early is critical. You also got to be got to look in the mirror and brutally honest with where you are in your plants about performance. If you're doing great, fantastic. If you're measuring OE, fantastic. But if you're not, it's a great opportunity to take do a deep dive. And the other thing is suppliers need to develop resources that understand OEE. Many plants we go into, there's a complete lack of awareness of what OEE is. And if you don't know what it is, you don't know how to fix it. If you don't improve your operational performance, I can tell you that the cost to the OEMs in lost production, in units lost because of supplier plants impacting their manufacturing operations is billions of dollars in lost units. So if you're a sequencer and you're making tires and wheels and sequencing it to a plant that's building a popular SUV and you don't ship and you shut it down, everybody in this room knows what that costs per minute. So the pain associated with not performing is huge. Today's highly integrated world, when a supplier gets in trouble, we all know that the buffers are gone, the immediate impact on a plant, we don't have days anymore, it's hours. If you're supplying to broadcast, you may have 3 or 4 hours of visibility to what you need to build, right? So the thermometer gets hot pretty quick. So failing to improve the operational metrics is not easy, but again, moving or changing suppliers in my opinion, and the OEMs we work with, moving suppliers is no longer a simple option. You know, when do you build a bank? How do you make it happen? They would rather work with you, help you, do everything they can to help you than to move it. But you have an operational responsibility to do your part as well. Things you can do to address it. I'm a big believer in eat an elephant one bite at a time. So break your plan into zones. Figure out, you know, instead of thinking about the big picture and it's overwhelming, break it down. How am I doing in zone 1, zone 2, and whether it's aligned with your team structure or the way your supervisor is set up. Manage complexity by breaking it down, and that's important. So build what we call zone control, zone metrics, and do everything you can to have rapid and immediate feedback. So the minute you begin to degrade and you tip, react, and recenter, and go back to that concept of OEE SPC. And then do everything you can to develop and have an OEE dashboard so that you have operational metrics being fed to you and pushed to you in real time that are simple, easy to understand, tell you where to go and how to react. Leadership has to live and breathe operations. You got to walk the floor. When you go for a Gemba walk, ask the tough questions. How am I running? What's my OEE? What's my scrap rate? Ask those questions. You have to make, in my opinion, huge investments in frontline supervision. They are the key to operational excellence. They are the front line. There's where rubber meets the road. Somebody, when I met earlier, they are the key people that are going to make a difference in you executing. And then again, we talked about stressing your systems early and hard, and process drift, like anything left unchecked, will lead to problems. At the end of the day, operational excellence is a buzzword, but in my opinion, if we don't fix it and we don't focus on operations, we're not going to win the game. So companies that master their operations are going to win. Companies that are able to manage complexity and all the challenges I talked about earlier are going to win. And companies that invest in frontline supervision are going to win. And that's going to make a difference. A lot stuffed in. I'm watching my clock. I got 4 minutes and 54 seconds, so I tried to stay on pace. I had real-time feedback. Yes, sir.
Well, first, thanks for that. That was really, really refreshing, I would say. Everything you said, I think everybody in here knows, and I'm thinking about my own plants and my supply base, and why is there such a big gap? Because I'm thinking about this now, and we struggle with it internally with all our plants and our suppliers. You got experience going many companies and things, and you see the same gap, right? So why do you think that is?
When you say gap in the performance, I think what happens is early on when we launch, we don't pay close attention to those key inputs, and we basically are that frog in the pot. So we don't measure when we're doing our pilot builds, are we hitting cycle time? Oh, we're using special means, it's not real. I don't know. And we find out because, frankly, we get compressed in our launch processes because of late changes and late capital and all that good stuff. And we don't really understand until very late in our curve where we're at. So the challenge is exposing that early, getting out of the special means and simulating real world, and then understanding mathematically where you're at and aggressively attacking it. What happens, though, is as you start to drift, leadership's got to step back and go, why? I think sometimes we get immersed in the fog of war, and all we care about is getting through the day. We all live in that, we just want to get through the day. And then if you step back and separate yourself as a leader and say, what's really fundamentally happening? I'm not hitting any of my targets. And ask why. I was at a plant the last couple of days where I asked for downtime data because we're doing an OE study. They couldn't give me anything. This is 2017. ERP, MIS, FIS, technology everywhere, and you can't tell me how much downtime you have by operation? So what am I doing? We're out there with a tally sheet. Check, 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 you know. So build simple little tools to go take a tally sheet, list the downtimes, turn it on its side, you got a Pareto chart, and off you go. It's about getting off our butts and going back out there and paying attention to the basics. And when it happens, reacting with intensity. And don't have a meeting about it, do it now. I sit in more meetings where we're talking about making lists of things to do. The Marines say you can do 3 things well. Shorten your agendas, in my opinion. That's what I tell my clients to do. Focus on the key things that are important. We get lost in so much stuff. So it's about intensity, speed to learning where you're really at. And it takes me less than half a day to walk into a plant and do an OE assessment and tell you where you're really at. You can do a quick OE in a couple hours, right? And then look at your charts and say, ask your team, what are we running at? 85. No, we're not. And then go deep. Now I'm down to 1:28. But there are some folks out in the lobby or in the main area that have got some pretty cool ways that you can track OE, but, find your constraint. That would be my first advice. And like we manage by exception, focus on the constraint, and then guess what? Fix the constraint, and guess what? Another one will pop up. And just like we solve quality problems, kill the number one issue, and then move to the next one. And systematically and methodically attack performance. So now I get to, big shooters come up now. I'm the Jerry Maguire.
I think you're what the first speaker, if we can remember this morning, talked about. Jamie was talking about Toyota production, so you're a highly engaged person. That's what you just talked about, every step of the way.
So you got to be passionate.
Don't ever go on a vacation with him. Can you imagine what goes off, 3, 4 cell phones at the same time?
Vacations are just places you take phone calls in on the beach. That's it.
Okay.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.